Welcome to my Authentic Pathways podcast, where I interview leaders whom I admire and I think are doing wonderful things in the world. Because my mission is to spread good news, more love, more sustainability, more peace. And I do this through my own leadership coaching and team coaching and giving trainings on emotional intelligence and well-being, leadership skills, in order to build cultures where there is more trust and where leaders do not need to overwork themselves, but can lead from a place of authenticity. That is today's topic, authentic leadership. Bridget is the perfect woman to join me with this conversation. Her name is Bridget McNamer. So welcome, Bridget.
I'm so happy to be here.
She's the founder and what she likes to call herself, the Chief Navigation Officer of Sidecar Council. She's from Montana, USA, and she's spent her whole life seeking adventure. She's currently nomadic, maybe a little less so than the last year. You're a little bit more settled now, but you're still trying to find your nest. But in the meantime, you are serving women leaders, primarily in schools, who need to bring the much needed balance to roles that have become over masculinized. So that's what I want to talk to you about, Bridget, is the role of women leaders in today's world and how to do that authentically as a woman, especially. So I thought we could get started with, let's define authentic leadership or even authenticity. What does that mean? And then perhaps in the leadership context, take us away with what your definition is. What do you think?
Sure. Before I answer that particular question, in the spirit of authenticity, I first want to say thank you because you are a leader in your own right that I have admired for a long time. I've appreciated your many attributes and skills and been so fortunate to be able to have you as a co-facilitator on summits. And so I just want to say how much I admire you and that I'm grateful to be here. A couple of notes. The first is that, and we're going to get into physicality, a subject that Karin and I do speak about in our coaching. I have been afflicted with a strange condition of being a bit stiff and sore. Not sure the reasons for it, but I'm now on a medication that makes me slur my words a little bit. So no, I am not drunk. So I think what it's giving me is the opportunity to slow down and make sure that I am comfortable about what I'm about to say. But that explains my stumbling over my words is, this medication that I'm on. Lastly, I will maybe occasionally refer to notes, not because this is not all very near and dear to my heart, but I'm used to being the interviewer, not the interviewee. So I was grateful to Karin for sharing her questions in advance so that I can be reflective and have some thoughts to share. Okay, let's start with authentic leadership. In my mind, authentic leadership starts with authentic personhood. So it's it's the who of you. So what are those sort of core aspects of your persona that make you very particularly and uniquely you, that have been a part of you from when you were born, when you were just a child, those traits, those attributes, those particularities. So I think it starts there. And then on top of that are layers that come with, well, let's just say years on this planet, like experiences that we have, expertise we gain, education and training that we go through, that all lead to certain perspectives that we have. And so that goes into our authentic personhood. And then a very important aspect of this is self-awareness. So giving ourselves that gift of time and deliberate reflection so that we are clear and aware about the who of us and all those experiences and expertise and perspectives we've gained, what our values are, what our triggers are, what's important to us. So self-awareness is a key part of authentic personhood. And as Karin will appreciate, there's this embodiment aspect to that. So it's only in the last decade or so that I have really truly appreciated how our bodies can really be our best allies in self-awareness, because they contain so much wisdom about who we are and how we are and what bothers us. And so if we can really befriend our bodies and use them appropriately as sort of a GPS for us, that's a powerful tool in our authentic personhood. And that leads me to then, what is authentic leadership? Well, I think that's when authentic personhood comes to the leadership role. And so the leadership role is what it is, and sometimes has been defined by, years, decades, eons of more of a masculine approach to leadership. And so when an authentic person comes to a leadership role, there's a context, there is culture, there is a way of doing things that, in this case, she is stepping into. And so that gives her opportunities for growth, that gives her opportunities for expansion, and truly for bringing herself and her authentic person to that role. It might mean that she's going to be stretching her growth and learning edges through being in this role. And then it may also come to a point where, gosh, she is tested so much that it's really a case of her integrity being challenged, or values being challenged. And in that case, that's not growth and expansion. That's an opportunity to say, nah, this is not where my authentic person can serve effectively, and certainly not without taking a beating. So that's how I'm thinking about authentic leadership.
Well said, Bridget. I love the way you've kind of unpacked that for us. There's a couple of points I want to touch upon, and I've quickly written them down so that I don't forget them as well.
Mhm.
And the first one is this idea of self-awareness. And when I think back for myself, I mean, the first conversation I had was with actually an ex-boyfriend of mine I hadn't seen in years. And he was going through some therapy, and he said that he was in search of his authentic self. And I was like, what is that? Come on. I had no realization of all the different layers, the complexities. I just felt I'm me. I show up as me everywhere I go. Like, what? I didn't have the feeling I was being inauthentic.
Mhm.
By now, I realized, gosh, there's so many layers. And as you say, like, it was my body that told me, right? And it was my body that was starting to challenge me to see I was in a position as well where I was being stretched, and not only stretched, but tested, and
Mhm.
where my values were no longer being aligned, and, all that kind of thing, like you talk about. What's the journey been for you where you realized
Mhm.
what self-awareness was,
Yeah.
that there is this thing? Because when you ask people, are you self-aware? I think 95% will say, yeah, I'm self-aware. I know who I am.
Mhm.
And how did you figure out you actually didn't quite know, perhaps?
Yeah. So, yeah, I think I've gone through my life thinking I was self-aware, but that was self-awareness based on this. I spent the majority of my life denying that there was anything important from the neck down. And let's say there are a number of reasons for that. I think partly my Catholic upbringing. I think partly just a certain sense of physical awkwardness when I was young that then made me just see my body as my enemy. And so I, in a very studied way, decided I'm going to ignore my body and just focus on my brain. So that was what I presumed was a successful approach until I hit my 50s. And that's when my body revolted and said, enough of ignoring me. So sciatica became an ever increasing annoyance to me. menopause hit, a number of other physical sort of conditions made it clear to me that I could no longer ignore my body. And so when I started paying more attention to it, what I heard was, "Oh, your body is reacting this way." It's not the menopause as much as the sciatica and other things, because you've been ignoring it, because you are taking on a lot of responsibilities that are kind of going beyond what you're capable of. That I was a wife and a mother and a breadwinner and, just a person in society. And yeah, I just was kind of ignoring me. I was paying a lot of attention to all other stakeholders and I was ignoring me. I spent several years paying attention to the signals that my body was sending me and just reconsidering what self awareness is. Through that process, it's become quite deliberate and quite intentional and quite fun. In fact, I have really spent time getting to know the who of me a lot better. And that's been quite fun and a very intentional process of going back and looking at where's the DNA piece of that, where's the ancestry and that kind of heritage. What about, and Karin, you'll understand this reference, but kind of sites of shaping, those sort of institutions and factors, cultural and otherwise, that shaped how I thought about myself. That includes everything from family to school to historical forces shaping my upbringing to culture. What was the culture like I was growing up in, the community? What was my sort of spiritual landscape? What was my actual landscape? So all of those things that affected how I thought about myself. And so it's been a very interesting process. I'm still going through it. I'm enjoying this kind of excavation process. I think it is something that everybody ought to treat themselves to, but it's been quite revelatory to me that there's still so much I can discover about myself and benefit from this self awareness, even as I'm entering this sort of third stage of my life.
Well, thanks for sharing that. You described the sciatica, for example, that you were starting to experience. So the embodiment of, I guess, not listening to your body to the point that your body was sending you signals of pain. What did you discover is then the connection between something that could be quite physical? You go to the doctor, I have sciatica, and
Mhm.
then the mental and emotional aspects, right? That your values are being challenged or that you were taking care of everyone else, but not really you. How did
Yeah.
you make that bridge? Because I think many people, including myself, I was going to the GP saying, I've got this and I've got that and I've got that. And I wasn't connecting all these physical symptoms with what was actually going on with me emotionally, mentally. How did you make that connection?
Yeah, well, it wasn't me, it was my osteopath. So I'm going to give a lot of credit to my Dutch osteopath, Floris Decker, whom I adore and am so grateful to. So this sciatica, one of my Dutch friends said, you ought to see an osteopath about it. I went to Floris. He examined me and poked and prodded. And he said at the end of our first session, and those on the line who are from the Netherlands or in the Netherlands will appreciate this Dutch directness. He said, pardon my Dutch, but I have the feeling you are somebody who just doesn't shit all over the place.
Nice.
Quite literally, I was constipated. But secondly, that I am somebody that holds things in,
Mm.
figuratively, that I don't share what's bothering me. I don't share my pain. And after kind of being a bit aghast by the Dutch directness, I was struck by how accurate he was. And so in the sessions that unfolded with Floris, he was able to help me figure out that I was holding together a family system in a way that was not sustainable, in part because I was not someone who shared what was really going on with me and what my own struggles were, because I'm a reforming people pleaser. Many women are people pleasers, and I didn't want to upset or disappoint. So I began this process of gradually realizing I can't hold this all together. I need to be able to upset and disappoint in order for this system, if it's going to actually function, to find its way without me being the one that unsustainably holds it together. So it was that, really, Karin, and that just led to a process of unfolding, and then me being a lot more clear about what my body was telling me, how to listen to that, how to really honor my body and see it as an asset rather than an annoyance. And of course, there were some really difficult challenges and consequences to paying attention to my body, including a divorce, including challenges with my then teens. We're all good now. So,
Yeah, it's incredible how our body is speaking to us if we listen, if we can read the signs.
mhm.
So either in this case, it was someone telling you, uh, and then in other cases, once you kind of get into understanding that the body is trying to send you a message, that you can be more self-aware and reflect yourself, or work it out maybe with a coach or someone else, a therapist. But what you described, Bridget, I think is, and I might be speaking for myself, but I'm working with clients as well, mostly women. What you describe, I think, is very cultural. This idea of women serving, women taking care of others before their own needs. And what's interesting as well is that divorce rates peak in their 50s. You mentioned that you kind of woke up around 50.
Mhm.
And something happens, I guess, in perimenopause, starting menopause, that the body no longer can hold that endless serving and the people pleasing. I'm also a people pleaser, but I didn't realize the extent of it, the extent that I was ignoring, and
Mhm.
until you kind of hit this wall or this crash. I mean, I would hope for most people that they can discover that before, but sometimes that is the wake up call.
Mhm.
And then I'm curious, what does masculinity have to do with all of this? When you talk about exploring your DNA, your ancestry, the physical landscape, but also the cultural landscape and the places where you've worked,
Mhm.
and this idea that leadership has been so masculine.
Mhm.
You described how it no longer felt appropriate in the family unit, that
Mhm.
you were not able to be fully yourself, authentically you. How has this worked out in the workplace
Mhm.
or leadership? We're talking not necessarily, man or woman. It's more the
Mhm.
masculine, feminine attributes. So if we're looking at masculinity.
Well, I might start with just this notion of the patriarchy, because I think if we think in those terms, then we realize that both women and men are affected in sometimes negative ways with this notion of the patriarchy, which is quite systemic and ascribes certain roles and expectations for men and women that for eons have diminished women, have put them in the background, have told them that their voices don't matter, that have told them that they don't have choices, and yeah, that they are kind of not even full persons in some cases. So I think that is the backdrop. And then let's look at the school landscape. So I've been coaching mostly women leaders in schools for, well, more than 8 years now. What has become very clear to me is that the school leadership landscape, like many industries, in fact, like the world, was set up by and for men. And not just men, but men who have someone at home to take care of, household responsibilities, men who are probably white and cisgender. And so that's kind of the historical, cultural kind of context that have shaped the school leadership landscape. Let's just keep it defined to that. And so when women are stepping into that, they are not that. Some are a little bit more that way. And there is nothing wrong with that. But they too can then face some penalties for being female, but acting in ways that are sort of coded as masculine. And so even those women might find themselves in a bit of a bind and criticized for taking on masculine traits and not falling back into sort of a traditional gender role and gender expectations. So, what this means for women that want to lead as their authentic selves is that they are scourged with imposter syndrome, which shows up more often for women. But it is that sense of, what am I doing here? I don't belong here. And we tend to then gaslight ourselves and to say, oh, I'm not good enough. I'm not ready for this. I'm not the material for being a school leader, because what we're walking into is a landscape that was made by and for men, as I've described. So it's not a wonder that women stepping into that role can feel those feelings, because the context and the culture are, not set up with them in mind. So then trying to find ways to navigate that authentically and not be tempted to embrace the role and perform becomes a challenge. Yeah.
A common friend of ours, she described how a friend of hers was told she was a judge and she had to lower her voice and speak lower because otherwise she wouldn't be taken seriously. Or
Mhm,
comments about what she was wearing.
mhm,
Um,
mhm.
those are the questions that you get asked. And I think it still happens. So, what do you suggest, Bridget? What do you do then as a woman who needs to operate in this kind of an environment?
Well, there are a few things. I think, first of all, it starts with getting to know and trust yourself. And so, really, that piece around self awareness that we've already gone over. And my hope is that more women find that way to truly embody that. And, Karin, you have some wonderful coaching techniques around that. It's an area that I explore as well, but really grounding yourself in your own presence and getting to know your soma. So that's beyond your body. It's really kind of the whole, as I call it, the real estate that you occupy when you walk through the world. So I think it can start there by reminding yourself of yourself, what you're bringing particularly to this role. I think it also depends on, I'm going to make a list here, but vision. So having a strong vision about what you want to accomplish in your role at your school and holding that as a very steady guiding light, that can help, especially when the seas get choppy. Added to that are a very keen sense of your own values. And so I do work on values with a lot of my coaching clients. I think a lot of people have a long list of values. And as Brene Brown advocates, try to really be discerning and hone in on the top two that are your headlights. I think that's a very interesting, sometimes demanding exercise to go through, but you know your values when they're challenged. something that makes you really angry, especially something that gets your hackles up, you know that your values nerve has just been touched. So getting very clear on that, because values are so integrated with integrity. But integrity really is kind of that storehouse of your values. When women are leading and finding themselves, gosh, with their integrity shaken, that can be a sign of something so serious that they need to confront and have some very courageous conversations with, well, contextually, whatever is at play there. Or they need to consider that this is no longer a place that they can stay, because what's most important is to walk away with integrity intact. So I guess what I've gone over is self-awareness, particularly as that gets embodied. We talked about vision, I've talked about values, and then there's this kind of courage that comes when those values get crossed. So I think those are some ways. And then I'm not going to overlook the importance of support. Leading is lonely. Being a leader in an international school is particularly lonely, and especially for women, because you don't have that same support from peers that you might have in other contexts. Find ways of connecting with others in the international school landscape that can be supportive of you. There are different ways to do that. I host sidecar rallies, I call them. These are monthly meetups for women leaders in international schools, and really meant for peer support and to help diminish some of that loneliness I talked about. I also host in-person gatherings that I call summits. ISS hosts a annual symposium for women leaders. There are women ed chapters in many countries and cities throughout the world. So finding your network of champions, as I say, just your support network. I've heard Fran Poland call it your kitchen table. Pauline O'Brien, I think, calls it your sort of advisory cabinet. It can be that too, but just making sure you're not doing this alone is vital.
You're such a coach, Bridget, because you summarized what I was going to say.
Great minds think alike.
I mentioned something in addition to what you said about the self-awareness piece, the embodiment, the values, integrity. I think the courage piece is huge. I mean, even if we go back to your own personal example of, if I need to be authentic in my family environment, I no longer fit here. I mean, that takes so much courage. And then to do that also in a workplace environment where you possibly have worked for long and you have the connections, and to realize, wow, this is no longer the place for me. You do need to have those courageous conversations to try and make it the place for you. See if there is that room, both, I guess, in the personal and the professional realm. Leading authentically takes courage. We can't stay quiet. We need to voice what we need and what we want. We need to stand close to our values when they're challenged. And then there's another piece that I want to bring up, and that's the idea of compassion. So the self-compassion, I think, especially, I almost feel like it has to start from that piece, because we beat ourselves up and we feel incredibly guilty when we decide perhaps to leave a job or leave a family. And there can be a lot of guilt and shame, and, especially because these courageous choices are not often accepted by your immediate family or friends, perhaps, are not understood. That also, again, takes courage. But there's the self-compassion piece, because we are so self-critical.
Yes.
So in order to make it through to the other end, we cannot beat ourselves up. We need to be our best friend.
Yes.
We need to start with trusting ourselves.
But I'm going to back up and tie it back into the courage piece. So my sidecar metaphor is really about adventure. And I know that you can relate to that, Karin, because you too are an adventurous person and you recognize that to be a woman leader in international schools, you have to be an adventurous person. There are just so many, and Farhana and Crystal and Allison, I'm sure we're speaking to the converted here because you are leaving communities, schools, cultural contexts that you've been familiar with and going out into the big, broad world and bringing your authentic self to that. And there's culture shock and there are twists in the road. If I'm going to stay on the adventure metaphor, there are muddy patches. You can't see around the corner. You have to be ready for adventure
Mm.
to be a female leader and a female leader in an international school, particularly. So that can also bring thrills. So I want to be clear about that. I don't think people would go into it just thinking muddy patches and blind corners. I think they're thinking there's something very exciting about this in a way I can put my own stamp on things. And that is very true. But with adventure, it necessitates courage. You cannot face an adventure without having a courageous approach. And that means facing difficult situations where you're making yourself vulnerable.
Mm.
So we can go back to a Brene Brown approach to courage, which means you have to be willing to be vulnerable. And so that's where the compassion piece can come in and must come in. Because if you're going to make yourself vulnerable, you also have to be ready to be the source of compassion for yourself because there's no guaranteed outcome. And getting into the ring and showing that courage and being willing to have that difficult conversation with that member of your leadership team that is, I don't know, showing up in ways that are really discombobulating for the rest of the team, or being willing to stand up to your board and remind them where their lane is and where it is not, and that they're crossing into your lane and this is no longer okay. So, whatever the courageous situation is, it's not always going to go well.
Mm.
And so, if you are not compassionate with yourself, it's very difficult to find that compassion necessarily in others in ways that are truly important. We're very good at being self-critical, but it is really necessary and not practiced enough to take the time to treat ourselves the way we would a really good friend and show up for ourselves and remind ourselves that we're great. And that took a lot of courage. And gosh, you must be feeling, you know, really disappointed right now. And here's a hot toddy and a hot bath and take care of yourself right now and sleep in tomorrow. We need to bring that kind of tender self-compassion to ourselves.
Mm. Yeah, I feel like this is also not a foreign concept to probably everyone in the call, but to actually feel that, to
Mhm.
feel the self-compassion, oh, yeah, I can take cognitively, we can be like, yeah, I can take a bath, I can treat myself, I can sleep in. But to translate that to an actual feeling, I have found to be quite different.
Mhm.
Even me, my own coaching journey, to fully feel love for yourself.
Well, I think part of that practice is to go back to some traits that so many women have. I'm not going to say all, but so many women who are in kind of service roles like education that are really about others. We're really good at taking care of others. And so there's a practice of externalizing ourselves and maybe even referring to ourselves in the third person if that's what it takes. And just to say, okay, what do I need to be aware of with Bridget today? I started doing that, yeah, about 8 years ago because I was so used to, yes, my child, my husband, others. and I was left off the list. So I started just putting myself on the list as Bridget. And so to kind of third person myself, somehow that was the psychological trick that I could say, oh, yeah, okay, Bridget needs attention too. And then I could bring that same level of compassion and care to Bridget as I was bringing to others. So it really is internalizing that trait that we have often quite naturally for women. Again, I'm not going to speak for all women, but for many, and to apply that then to ourselves. And it is a practice. It's not something that will shift overnight.
It is intentionality. It is a practice. All of this is a practice. To show up authentically is a practice. These are daily choices that you make to decide to speak up, to decide to say no, whatever it is. I would love to see if people that have joined us have any comments or questions for Bridget. Anything that stood out that you listened to?
I've got a couple of questions, but I'm going to try and limit them. In high pressure moments, I've noticed it's quite easy to disconnect from the physical signals in favor of staying composed. So where should I start? What might help leaders become more aware of and perhaps curious about what their body is telling them at those moments?
Yeah, that's a really good point you're bringing up, Allison. And what I would advocate for, because you don't have the luxury of time and space, but to try to carve out whatever time and space you can to take a moment to be grounded, to take the measure of what's going on with you physically, to and this comes more easily if you have a practice of paying attention to bodily signals. So I'm going to advocate for that in advance of high pressure situations, but also to especially pay attention to your breathing, because likely your breathing is quite shallow in those moments. So taking even a few seconds to calm your breathing, to do a kind of 3-4, talk to Karin. She's quite advanced in breath work these days.
Yeah.
I'm sure she can tell you a few good, quick exercises to do with breathing, but it might just be breathe in for 4 long seconds, breathe out for 6. The exhale is the most important. That's what's going to calm your nervous system more. And if you do need to just take a bathroom break or just say, excuse me, I've got to take a quick call, or even just being authentic and saying, this feels like a really important moment and I want to be fully present for it. I'm going to just take a moment in my office to regroup and I'll come back out here. I think that is a very courageous thing to do because it's also modeling for others.
Yeah.
How important it is to be very physically present, very physically aware, so that you are responding rather than reacting to a high stakes situation.
I like the responding versus reacting part. That's something I can do. And the breathing is in progress, work in progress.
Life is a work in progress,
Oh, it is. It is. And I have one more question, if I may. You were talking earlier about servant leadership, and we talked about how we saw servant leadership sitting alongside authentic leadership. We work in multinational, multicultural environments. So I'm curious how we can be seen to still hold authority and make these difficult decisions while still leading from the heart with compassion and all of that, even when there are these unspoken expectations, perhaps from different cultures. I don't want to say male dominated, but I will now, to embody this more traditional leadership stance.
Sure. And I'll just start by saying quite authentically that I'm not a fan of servant leadership. I think there is a model out there of servant leadership which doesn't pay attention enough to the leader, her himself. I think there's a different approach. Karin was part of this summit, as was Farhana, where we discussed love-based leadership. And that's quite distinct from servant leadership. It's also distinct from command and control, or, something that might feel a little bit more top down or hierarchical. That is the more traditional model of leadership that's been developed over eons and stages and is very much on display now. But love-based leadership really starts from a place of love for yourself. And then, which also means self-respect. So that is, I think, I'm not going to say servant leadership means you lose your self-respect. I don't believe that. But I do believe that you don't have to lose yourself in a love-based leadership scenario. And that sometimes loving is hard, right? Loving doesn't simply mean showing compassion. Loving doesn't simply mean making sure everybody feels good about themselves. Sometimes, as a loving leader, you need to call things out. You need to recognize that all is not well. You need to recognize and have a courageous conversation with someone who is not necessarily acting in a loving way or is disrupting the school. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, Allison.
That was my question. What your thoughts are on, because there is this expectation to leave, I think in education, at least in some schools, to really lead serving community. Sometimes you have to make decisions which are unpopular, but I mean, for me, my values are non-negotiable and I'll always stick with them. But there's this expectation. So I was curious about the navigation of this serving the community or serving your stakeholders or whatever it is versus being authentic in yourself.
Yeah. And I think where the rubber hits the road is that integrity piece. Or if you feel like your integrity and your values are truly being challenged and that you need to put them aside in order to fulfill what your school community is asking for.
Yeah.
I'm curious, Karin, if there's anything you might add to that.
Well, to the first question, again, it goes back to what we were saying before. It's a practice. So you want to practice the breathing, the centering, the grounding when you're not a high stakes environment. You're not going to go out and do the Formula One or the Olympics without the step-by-step training. And so high pressured environments is kind of like when your values are being tested as well. But it's a practice. It's a practice of self-compassion. It's a practice of taking these little courageous steps. It's a practice of the physicality, of listening to your body, understanding when it's tired, what energizes you, what makes you feel expansive, what makes you feel like you're contracted and being kept stuck, what feels freeing, the awareness of it. That is a practice. And it's also a journey, like we've all said. And it's never ending. Gosh, like the self-awareness piece, it's just like this onion that just keeps peeling and peeling and peeling. It's like you never get to the core. And because we also keep changing and our environments keep changing, so we get tested in different ways. And with those challenges, those muddy potholes and whatnot, they're also opportunities to gain more self-knowledge. And without those, our lives would be kind of boring at some point as well, right? And so if we only had the beautiful vistas, we're not being stretched. We're not growing. Seeing those potholes, how difficult and muddy we sometimes get in them, and how incredibly hard they can be, they are also that opportunity where the stretch and the growth happens.
For sure. Thank you.
Bridget, if there's one piece of advice that we maybe haven't talked about authentic leadership, leading in a masculine world, what would that be?
Yeah, I think I'm just going to go back to the embodiment piece because I find it so important and so valuable. So I am going to say, get to know your body, make friends with your body. Women spend way too much time feeling bad about their bodies because they feel like they don't look the way they want to. And that is coming from a masculinized world. But I am going to say your body can truly be your best companion when it comes to navigating life. And if we pay attention to it, if we show curiosity about what it can teach us, if we show care and companionship, it will be our best navigation source. And so I think there's much we can do to get familiar with, get to know our bodies and our broader somas, and both use them as compasses for ourselves, but also just tend to and care for them because it's worth it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And actually, related to that embodiment, just one last comment that's popped into my head is, besides the physicality of it, but really getting to know the emotions and being able to process and sit with your emotions, to be
Yeah.
able to manage your thoughts, to be able to hear your own intuition.
Yes.
That is something else that I think I also did for a very long time, is just not even know what that is,
Yeah.
or know that it's there and hear it, but just completely ignore it.
The very first time I stepped into a therapist's office was in 2008. I don't even remember what issue I was bringing to her. I do remember that halfway through the session, she said to me, "Well, gosh, where does that land in your body?" And I thought, "What? Like, are you crazy? Like, what are you talking about?" And now I get it.
Okay. Well, Bridget, thank you. We could continue talking on this topic for a while. I appreciate you all coming on the call and bringing in your valuable questions and just your presence. It's nice to have more people and more energy in the room. Bridget, thank you for all your nuggets of wisdom, for joining me today to talk about authentic leadership.
Thank you for the three of you who came to be witnesses and support. I hope you learned something, and I hope this has maybe generated some ideas that you can put into practice.
So if you enjoyed what you heard and you're looking for some more self-awareness, understanding what this embodiment actually means, feel free to reach out to me or to Bridget, or if you know anyone else who might be interested in learning more about authentic leadership, then I'd love to be in touch with them. All right, take care. Bye.